Good morning in Washington and good evening in Jakarta. This is David Merrill of the U.S. Indonesia Society, USINDO. Welcome to today's USINDO Open Forum on Understanding Indonesian Terrorism, Current Trends, Causes, Policy Implications, with our featured speaker, Dr. Julie Chernov Hwang, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science and International Relations at Goucher College near Washington. Julie has spoken at USINDO before on Indonesian issues related to radicalism and terrorism, as well as on Indonesian de-radicalization programs, and we're delighted to have her back. Coinciding with the release of her new book, Becoming Jihadis, Radicalization and Commitment in Southeast Asia, published by Oxford University Press. I would like to also mention that there's great interest apparently in this topic, particularly by Indonesians. Most of our viewers today are Indonesians, although we have a good representation of Americans. So it indicates to me that this is a topic that Indonesians particularly would like to understand more and are not getting enough information on. So we're going to fill that gap today. Although it's been 5 years since the last major terrorist attack in Indonesia, terrorism remains a significant threat. To address it, the Indonesian government mounted a campaign of arrests targeting domestic Islamic extremists. This was a while ago. Regarding Indonesian ISIS families remaining in Syrian camps, something we know little about. The government decided to have them remain there, except for orphans under the age of 10. Each of these moves has consequences. As a consequence of the sweeping arrests of domestic jihadi militants, the rank and file members are now coming into direct contact with even more extreme hardliners. And although few Indonesian ISIS-affiliated men have survived in Syria, more than 500 Indonesians, mostly women and teenagers, remain in Syrian camps, where they're vulnerable to ISIS recruiters and thus a long-term latent threat. Thus, although the issue is largely out of public sight, it is not solved. The more well-known groups are largely out of sight or reduced in strength. However, there are remaining circumstances in play which could lead to a future resurgence of terrorists or ISIS-affiliated Indonesians if not well handled. Julie will acquaint us not only with the current latent situation, but also with the underlying processes and pathways which motivate Indonesian Muslims to join jihadi groups and commit to them, and why specific persons are selected to participate in acts of terrorism. Also, she has findings on how and why those previously committed to terrorism may come to disengage from violence and reintegrate back into society, what has worked and what has not worked in programs to do that. In that connection, her 2018 book, Why Terrorists Quit: The Disengagement of Indonesian Jihadis, addressed that topic, analyzing some innovative de-radicalization programs that were undertaken by Indonesia at that time. And she can go over the pluses and minuses of that. Julie's remarks will be followed by Q&A session. Please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Julie, welcome back to USINDO, and please proceed.
Thank you so much, David, and for your gracious introduction. Thank you so much, terima kasih banyak, to everyone for coming out today. Indeed, we have to be careful before assuming that just because there haven't been major terrorist attacks in Indonesia as of late, that Islamist extremism is a thing of the past. There have been tremendous successes. As of late May 2023, there are some 419 Indonesians in prison on terrorism charges and another 502 in police custody awaiting trial. And this number includes both members of Jemaah Islamiyah and members of pro-ISIS groups, but that doesn't mean that the threat is dormant. Even during the most repressive years of the new order, Indonesia's Islamist extremist fringe survived. Jemaah Islamiyah has survived periods of mass arrest before, and they have reacted strategically to constrain political environments. Jemaah Islamiyah plays the long game, and they will survive this period, and they will regenerate. Does this mean Jemaah Islamiyah is likely to start launching terrorist attacks again? Highly unlikely. Instead, it is most likely they will continue their efforts at dakwah, fundraising, recruitment, and eventually move into paramilitary training and stockpiling of weapons. And how do we know this? Because this was the pathway that they pursued following the last series of mass arrests in 2007. And so we can assume that some version of this will repeat. First, doing the nonviolent low-risk activities and then moving into more moderate risk activities. But there are two spaces to watch regarding terrorism, and that's post-so and returning foreign fighters. More than 100 ex-members of extremist groups, ex-terrorists, have been released in post-so according to a recent unpack report, giving it the dubious distinction of having more ex-prisoners than any other district in Indonesia. And dozens more are scheduled to be released this year. This includes some 26 members of Mujahideen Indonesia Timur, or MIT. And this raises a question whether we will see a reconstituted and revitalized MIT as a group that commits acts of terrorism, as a group that provides paramilitary training to other extremists, or simply as a group that preaches an extremist dakwah. And that is unknown, but it's worthy of monitoring and watching. And second, as David noted, as of this time last year, there were 545 Indonesian citizens in Syria, also 23 in Afghanistan, and 32 in the Philippines. Now, the majority of Indonesians in Syria are women and children, mostly residing in the Al-Hol and Al-Roj camps. Now, as David noted, the government has decided to only repatriate children under 10 who are orphans. But prior to that decision in 2020, there were 182 who returned, and they still need to be reintegrated. This also leaves a cohort of young men, prime targets for ISIS recruitment. We know ISIS is recruiting in Al-Hol and Al-Roj. And the question then raises, these young men are now in the age group where they would be recruited. And this raises a question, and it's a question open for debate. Will these young men who become members of ISIS, these stateless young men, will they be deployed to Afghanistan and deployed perhaps to the Sahel or other spots in the Middle East and go on and fight and die there? Or would some eventually return home to Indonesia to avenge their mothers and attack the homeland that abandoned them? And that is something that is worthy of watching. Now, Indonesian foreign fighters in Afghanistan and the Philippines carry a greater risk still. It is a smaller number, but it carries a greater risk still of eventual return. And so all of these populations of extremists do need to be monitored, because these are where the continued risk lies. And all of this makes it all the more critical to understand. Oh, I am going to share my screen. all of this makes it all the more critical to understand why Indonesians and how Indonesians join Islamist extremist groups, why they commit, how they come to participate in acts of terrorism, and what enables successful disengagement and reintegration, and what is the role that the state has to play in that. And my new book does exactly that. Becoming Jihadis explores these four interrelated questions. Why does someone join? So motivations. What are the pathways via which one joins? How does one show commitment? And why does someone go on to participate in acts of terrorism, and why certain people are selected and others are not? This book draws on 97 interviews with 97 current and former members of Islamist extremist groups in Indonesia and 25 in the Philippines between 2010 and 2019. Because of our audience, I will be focusing exclusively on the Indonesian portion, but in total it was 175 interviews, as many of these were iterated interviews. And the book puts forth this argument that social ties play a critical role at every juncture in the joining process, from initial engagement to commitment to participation in jihad experiences, paramilitary training, and terrorism. It unpacks the process by which members build a sense of community, connection, and solidarity and brotherhood, how they come to trust one another and love one another, and how ideology functions as a binding agent, but not a cause. So with the remainder of my time today, I am going to be examining these 5 questions. And now to the first questions: what motivates? I found that people are motivated by an interplay of 2 factors: whom they know and what they seek. Joining an Islamist extremist group is very similar to joining a mainstream social group, a social movement. A person is more likely to join if they know someone in the group. So if you have family in the group, if you have friends in the group, if you have teachers in the group, if you have mentors in the group, you are going to be more likely to join that group. And as we all know here, Indonesia has one of the most open and diverse Islamic civil societies on the planet. And there are over a dozen Islamist extremist groups, over a dozen Salafi, Jihadi, and Takfiri groups. So why choose this one, or why choose that one? One key reason is because you click with the people in it, or you know someone in it. But it is not sufficient to simply know someone in the group. It also has to fulfill a need. And the needs that I found were seeking knowledge about Islam and jihad, seeking to improve Muslim lives, seeking revenge, seeking redemption, seeking jihad experiences, and mostly for the Philippines, financial incentives. That was very much a Philippine story, and I left the variable in there so that it would be present as a variable. Now, seeking knowledge of Islam and jihad, I wouldn't want anybody to think that someone seeking to learn more about Islam is going to find their way into a Salafi jihadi group because that's where they choose to learn about Islam. That is not the case. Although in the Philippines, there were a few members of the Maute group from the Maute family who heartbreakingly were teenagers. They were anak SMP, they were 10 and 11 and 12 and 13, and they joined because they wanted to learn to read the Quran, and their uncles were teaching the classes. But in Indonesia, it doesn't work like that. In Indonesia, it is seeking a practical knowledge about jihad, a practical knowledge that you would not learn in a PKS study circle, or a Hizb ut-Tahrir study circle, or or Muhammadiyah study circle. Seeking to improve Muslim lives, this category could vary between living in a neighborhood that was high crime and seeking to clean up your neighborhood, like the members of Team Hisbah, or it could also mean people who joined during the time of the Maluku conflict and the Poso conflict, who wanted to help and protect Muslims from Christian militias during that period. Seeking revenge was a category for 26 men from Poso who were seeking revenge from Christian militias after the Wali Songo massacre, where they either lost dozens of family members or saw headless bodies floating down the river for weeks after, or for members of MEIT, wanting to attack the police for perceived injustices. Seeking redemption was a category that's very interesting. I saw this in Indonesia and the Philippines. There's a gender dynamic here. For women, it was a smaller crisis, a divorce and abandonment by your family, the loss of custody of one's children, and a person then going abroad and wanting to seek redemption for a life that was seen as too sinful. And so they moved from study session to study session to study session until they found a Salafi jihadi study session or an ISIS study session. And this was particularly resonant. We saw this in Nava Narania's work on maids who had, migrant maids who had gone abroad to Malaysia or to Hong Kong or to Singapore and had been radicalized. For men, it was a multidimensional crisis. It wasn't just a divorce. It wasn't just feeling your life was out of control. It was your business went bankrupt, your wife divorced you, you lost your home, you lost your car, you lost custody of your children, you lost everything. And then a cousin came up to you and said, hey, your life would be a lot better in Syria. And this replicated again and again and again in Indonesia. For men, the bar was much higher. In the Philippines, it also was a much higher bar for men. It was these multidimensional crises that led them to join the Mautes, join ISIS, or go to Syria. Jihad experiences was someone simply seeking the opportunity to go on jihad. That was their motivation. And then financial incentives was largely a Philippine story, although there were instances of young men who were in prison seeking the comfort of the Salafi jihadi groups because it provided better food. But in those cases, those men were rarely fully recruited into Jamaat Islamiyah. That was a different story with ISIS. Unfortunately, I did not have the opportunity to interview those men. So this was largely a Philippine story about being offered more than a full year's salary to go fight in a jihad. So in short, without knowing someone in the group, there would be no way to gain entry. But that in itself is not sufficient. Joining has to fulfill a need that someone cannot fulfill or believes they cannot fulfill through a mainstream Islamic or Islamist organization. Perhaps they could, but they believe they couldn't. And that brings us to our second question: how does someone join? And I identified 5 pathways and 1 partial pathway to entry. There were 2 internal pathways, kinship and schools, and 3.5 external pathways. Internal pathways are pathways via which an individual is brought into the group by family, typically a parent, a sibling, or an uncle, occasionally a cousin, or a mentor, via multi-year indoctrination in specific radical schools. Our 3.5 partial pathways hinge on the study session. These are study sessions, conflict, prison, and social media are partial pathway. External pathways are ones where an individual is not born into the extremist group or socialized via education from a young age, but chooses to join based on joining a radical study session. And these study sessions may occur in a prison, they may occur in a conflict zone, they may occur in a mosque or a prayer room or a home. And it's important to say, and our Indonesian attendees will agree with this, it is so important to stress that study sessions are ubiquitous in Indonesia. In the United States, they would be likened to Bible study. Every type of Islamic and Islamist organization has study sessions. Progressive Muslim groups have them. NU and Muhammadiyah has them, and extremist groups have them too. For radical groups, for extremist groups, the study session is a multifunctional space. It is the key free space via which outsiders are indoctrinated and socialized and vetted. They are a mechanism for recruitment. They are a space for expressing radical ideas. They are a tool for cultivating solidarity and trust and brotherhood, and a means of inculcating and enforcing strict norms and worldview. There are levels of study sessions, from mass prayers and large group sessions on general topics where there might be 1 or 2 recruiters looking for the most dedicated attendees, to special study sessions where one learns more extremist content, and on as people are winnowed down and assessed and vetted until only the most committed remain. And these multi-tiered study sessions can last anywhere from a month in a conflict zones to 6 months to a year, depending on the group. If you are an outsider, the study session is your way in. Now, interestingly, in contrast to right-wing extremists in the US and Europe, and in contrast to ISIS, social media has largely been a partial pathway in Indonesia. Very few Indonesians were radicalized through social media exclusively. Indonesian recruiters tended to believe that too much reliance on social media was a way to get yourself infiltrated by the authorities. So in Indonesia, social media plays support roles, functioning either as a gateway where one first finds extremist content, or a means of finding like-minded friends who can connect you with recruiters, or a tool for follow-up and further indoctrination after initial contact has been made. Even individuals who claim to be radicalized online typically have a family member or a friend already in the group if you dig a little. Now, among all Indonesians, there's a very similar phenomena that takes place. Across all of these pathways, individuals interact with activists. They form social bonds and gain exposure to the ideology. This ideology is reinforced by family, by the school one attends, by what one learns in the study session. And the social bonds thicken and trust increases. Over time, they will be assessed for commitment. Do they adopt the norms and behaviors of the group? To what degree? Do they obey orders without question? Do they conform to a common religious understanding? Are they willing to relocate? Do they prioritize their in-group friends? Those who prove commitment become members, and those who may who do not become supporters or sympathizers or friends of the group, who may be on the fringes, but they don't get the opportunity to take the oath. Across every pathway, what I found was the most important factors were the social bonds that were built and the extent to which one was trusted. What makes a person join a group, what makes them stay and commit, are the loyalty they feel towards one another, the brotherhood they feel towards one another, and the love and trust, yes, love, they feel toward one another. And this even extends to acts of terrorism. One is more likely to be recruited into a terrorist cell if they are related to existing cell members, if they went to school with existing cell members, or if they were in training camps with existing cell members. The most important thing, even more than being a member of the group, is knowing someone in the cell and being trusted by them. Most will be members of the cell, but there are a handful of instances where people were recruited into the cell without ever taking the oath. Which brings me to my last question. What facilitates successful disengagement and reintegration? And in the interests of Q&A, I'm going to keep this brief, and we can talk about it much more in Q&A. The linchpin of successful disengagement and reintegration, what I found in my first book on terrorism, my third book, but my first book on terrorism, is that the linchpin of successful disengagement reintegration is the establishment of an alternative social network of supportive family members, friends, a supportive family, friends, and that should be mentors, not members, family, friends, and mentors, to act as a counterweight against the pull of one's former social and community ties. And why does that matter? Because Indonesia, it is such a social country. This is not something a person can do alone. It's not something a person can do alone anywhere. It's not something a person can do alone in the United States. If you read the biographies of the reformed white supremacists, they all had friends. They all had supportive family or friends or mentors. This is something that I'm finding over and over and over again. This is the key. But for Indonesians, as we know, you can, with Salafi jihadi groups, go inactive and still retain ties to in-group friends. So that alternative social network has to be a counterweight. So when your friend says, hey, come, we're going to get the gang together, we're going to have a training, you say no, because you don't want to lose what you've built. Subsequent to this, we could talk about priority shifts toward away from your group identity towards identities as a father, towards focusing on one's family, education, and gainful employment. You could also look at disillusionment and cost-benefit analysis, although that doesn't, in the Indonesian case, make someone leave the group. It may make them migrate from a violent to a nonviolent role within the group. And so that leaves us with this question, what can the government do? And I say what I always say with that question, the best thing that the government and civil society can do is to do this in a locality-driven way, focus on professional development, not worldview overhaul. Go into the localities, partner with local terrorist rehabilitation and local civil society organizations that can find out, do needs assessments and find out what do these men want to learn, so that who needs this, who needs training and professional development, what do they want to learn? And then give them options and provide those skills. And the difficulty is that that kind of project, a locality-driven project, disengagement takes time. And a locality-driven project is going to be tricky because it doesn't work with a fiscal year budget. But that does seem to be the way that the state could have really sustained benefits in helping people to disengage, helping them to reintegrate, helping them to conceptualize a post-group identity. And so with that, I will sum up 2 points I would like to have people take away. Number one, that members of a group, people join a group because they form social ties. Ideology functions as a binding agent, not a cause. Members commit and are united by a common worldview. That positive emotions, love, trust, and affinity are far more binding than hate and fear. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that fascinating interpretation and analysis.
I think I was 25 minutes on the dot.
You were. And I'd like to call for questions. The technology we have today is typing your questions through the, what's it called? The
chat.
The Q&A button on the bottom. So I invite questions. Otherwise, I have to do the questions from both our Indonesians. Okay, here's one, anonymous. Thank you for your presentation. Can you talk about some of the Indonesian government agencies involved in quote unquote addressing some of these issues? That's actually of great interest to, I think, a lot of us. Go ahead, Julie, on that one.
Okay, this is a wonderful question, and I'd like to point you to an article that just came out by Nurhuda Ismail. It's co-authored, but I know he is one of the authors. It is called Heads, Hearts, Hands. And that is something that really is the most up-to-date article speaking to what the Indonesian government is doing now. The major force working on it is BNPT, but all of these different government agencies are doing these little micro projects. So one government agency might be focused on making sure that released terrorists have, or that former prisoners have IDs. And another might be focused on providing education for children, and on and on and on and on. The one gap that I see is that things are still not being done at the local level. And the reason this matters, you have certain prisons offering life skills training, and this is fantastic. So one example of that is the Porong prison just outside of Surabaya, and this is absolutely fantastic. However, two of the key programs are with farming and animal husbandry. And a few years ago, some of the young men who wanted to be a part of this lived in cities. They wanted to learn things that were marketable in cities, like VCR and TV repair. And this was before streaming. And that would have been really good because as we've learned from, for example, the experience of Colombia, they trained a whole bunch of men who were about to be released, who had been former members of the FARC, in computers, thinking that then they could go back and they could have this great life, except they lived in rural areas where computers didn't exist. It is a wonderful thing to provide life skills training and professional development in prison. It's so helpful. It's one of the key things a government can do. But you have to have an assortment of options, and you need to poll the prisoners to find out what they want, and then reconcile this with what you could provide, because it makes no sense to teach someone to fish who lives inland. It makes no sense to teach someone farming and animal husbandry if they live in Jakarta. And so that is the area where that could be improved upon to make it even more effective.
Julie, I want to add on to that. Of course, the BMPT comes to mind first when we think about it. And that, but you mentioned a number of other things that give people life skills, and also mayors and localities and so many other things, fisheries. Now, are you aware whether the Indonesian government has any kind of coordinated mechanism to bring together all these things, or is it mainly each one does its own thing?
I believe at this point, it's each one does their own thing. That's after reading Heads, Hearts, Hands. It spoke about in detail about all of the different government agencies that were involved in this one common goal, but it didn't seem like there was a central, from what I gathered from the article, it didn't seem like there were monthly meetings where they were coordinating together. And so if that is the case, I would love to know that, because that would be fantastic.
I don't think it's the case. Of course, I'm not the expert, but I have not heard of any of that.
No, I haven't heard of that.
And so, without my being the expert, I just want to make the observation that if the Indonesian government decided to establish some kind of coordinated task force, might be a good idea.
It would be a great idea. It would also be a great idea to charge people, and this could be done in a fiscal year, to identify all of the programs operating in localities and the different bodies that could operate in different localities that would need money to carry out the kind of locally driven programs for reintegration, but could manage it logistically and who have the relationships, because that is something that could really, really help. What the needs of a jihadi being released in Poso are going to be different from one in Lamongan, and it can't be a one-size-fits-all program.
It's another question. We're going to go to another question.
Yes.
What are these agencies, these various agencies, doing both offensive and defensive efforts?
Well, we can see that the police have, the Densus 88 and the police have, since 2018, since about 2018, been really focused on arrests and wrapping up these networks, figuring out who is doing what and wrapping up the networks. We know this from looking at the Suharto era. A kinetic approach alone does not diffuse the security issue. It just delays it. So you have also these programs from different agencies. I wouldn't call them defensive. Tito Carnavian, the former head of Densus 88, called it the soft approach. And this is something that is focusing on replacing one's jihad identity with their post-jihad identity, their group identity with their post-group identity. So also focusing on, well, what does this person need? Look at us. The government is your friend. We are not Togut. The government is your friend. And we are going to provide, we're going to make sure that your children have enough, your wife can pay for school fees. We're going to facilitate your families, we'll provide some contracts, some basic survivability. We will do these little programs here and there with when you had more ISIS returnees who were women, the 182 that I mentioned who came before, there was a program called the Handayani Center that did a little trauma counseling, a little de-radicalization, provided some basic life skills. And And the typical stay at Handayani was 1 to 3 months. And this was a state civil society partnership. So you have these. The issue is that they're not coordinated. And the other issue, as we know, is that while Handayani was such a great idea, when someone has gone through trauma, it takes a lot more than 1 to 3 months for somebody to even start to go to post-traumatic growth. And there wasn't as much follow-up as there needed to be.
Okay. Here's a good one from our distinguished advisor, Dr. Barbara Harvey. What is the relationship, if any, between NU and Muhammadiyah and jihadi groups?
That is an excellent question. Thank you, Barbara. With NU, you see the ties are far weaker. If we want to look for ties between NU and any group on that extremist end of the spectrum, the link is FPE, Islamic Defenders Front. You do have members of NU who become members of FPE. But you don't have a link between the organizations in any way, shape, or form. You do have, and there's definitely been data to show this, and I can say this through just my interviewees, a number of them come from Muhammadiyah families. But that doesn't mean that Muhammadiyah has a relationship with the jihadi groups. What it does is it affords Muhammadiyah several really interesting opportunities. First of all, number one, and I love this, is that when you look at a lot of the people who work in the terrorist rehabilitation space, social workers who work in the terrorist rehabilitation space, a number of them are from Muhammadiyah families, and they can pull on that. You also have, you don't have Muhammadiyah as an organization working in the space, but you have young members of Muhammadiyah, men and women in their 30s and 40s and 50s who are working in the space, and they can pull on that. There have been also a handful of cases where people who have disengaged and reintegrated, most notably Ali Fawzi, who was a trainer with Jamaat Islamiyah and Mujahideen Kompak, when he disengaged and looked at reintegrating, he was from a Muhammadiyah family. And his brother, his half-brother, Ali Imran, basically, I imagine the conversation being like, you have to live for both of us, get your life together. Although I don't know if the conversation went that way. But when he thought about going back to school to get his BA and his MA and his PhD, where did he turn to? Muhammadiyah universities. Because you can't leave. You can't be nothing once you leave. You have to have a community. This is Indonesia. You have to have a community. And so he turned and went, and now he is either just finishing his dissertation or he just defended his dissertation. He's right on the border. And he did all of this through Muhammadiyah universities. And it was at the Muhammadiyah University, or at Muhammadiyah University, that he was able to reinvent himself and think of himself not just as a trainer, but as a student. And gain success and recognition as a student. So that is what I think the best relationship is it's sub-organizational. It's between individuals able to pull on the tide of being Muhammadiyah.
Yeah, let me make sure I understood. We understood. What I hear you saying is individual members of Muhammadiyah and NU may choose to get involved in activities, but that neither organization, as far as you know, has an organized program.
No, not at all.
So it begs the question of whether they should, but it's not for me to say, but it's out there. Okay. Mohammed Gibran. Dr. Julie, do you think Indonesia would need the Internal Security Act implemented like in Singapore or Malaysia?
No.
Why?
I was
That's
trying to be
wise
brief on
move.
that one.
Yeah.
Because first of all, Singapore, let's take Singapore. Singapore is so small. Singapore and Malaysia had this British training during the emergency that led to them having one of the most effective security services on the Asian continent. So they can have that and make it work effectively. But they also do not claim to be democratic. And they have shown that they are fully willing to abridge rights. Indonesia is huge. It is 14,000 islands. It's the world's largest Muslim nation. It is the 5th most populous country in the world. Logistically, they don't have the ability to implement it. And as Indonesia is calling itself a democracy, this would be such an abrogation of rights. Time and time again, we have seen that with the Indonesian jihadis, not Malaysian and Singaporean who were socialized and raised and who grew up knowing the Internal Security Act was a thing, but with Indonesian jihadis, you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, to use an American phrase. You build rapport, and as you build rapport through acts of treating the prisoner like a human being, they open up, they give information. You don't have to beat them senseless. In fact, beating them senseless is a surefire way of having them be still radical when you release them. So for cultural reasons, for logistic reasons, and for democracy reasons, I would say no.
All right. This is anonymous. I'm not sure you can answer this, but or should answer it. But are there efforts from the USA or other governments that are helping Indonesia with combating extremist activities, including funding, best practices, technology, etc.?
Well, I would say that I am not the person to ask that question, as I have no contacts with the US government. I teach at a small university called small school called Goucher College, and I'm not often brought into those conversations and
Let's
have
just
not
say,
been for a decade. Second, I would say that the US needs to focus on its own house and how we as a country deal with our problem of extremists. We should be offering funding or assistance. I don't know if we are, but we need best practices from other countries so we can know how to best handle our problem.
Right. I'm sure we at least talk to VMPT, but whether that amounts to a program is another matter.
I
Okay.
honestly wouldn't have the slightest, so
Right.
I can't answer.
That's fine. Nico Safavi, not sure if it is conjecture or fact, but the largest funding source for Salafi Wahhabi schools of Islamic thought in the past was attributed to Saudi Arabia. Are the Saudis a source? And if so, are these also tied to the numerous Wahhabi Islamic boarding schools in Indonesia, so-called study sessions and school paths? If not, what are the funding sources supporting the infrastructure to recruit and influence? I ask this as all successful movements need funding.
This is an excellent question. I would point you to Zach Abuja's work on funding. To the best of my knowledge, the Wahhabi school, the Wahhabi programs are run through Libya. Also, Margaret Scott's work on this. The Wahhabi programs are run through Libya. They are not coming through the local JI schools. ISIS only ever had really one school. MIT maybe had two. So really what we're talking about is the JI and affiliate schools network, and they were not funded by the Saudis. They were funded locally through their own foundations. Now, where that money is coming from, that I do not know. but there may be some Saudi money in it, but that was not where it's coming from. This is not a Saudi-led operation. This is indigenous. From 1948, you had the Darul Islam movement in Indonesia, which presented an alternative national imaginary to the idea of Pancasila as the national ideology. The movement and the rebellions they fostered were crushed in 1962. They continue as an underground movement. In 1993, January of 1993, Jamaah Islamiyah splits off. Why am I telling this story? Because this is a history going back decades, going back easily almost 75 years. So this is not coming from the Saudis, this is indigenous.
Salam al-Mariyati, I recognize that name. How many members of Jamaat Islamiyah do you think there are?
When last I checked, about 2,000.
Okay.
They were at their height, they had 2,000. And before the recent wave of arrests that started around 2020, it was back to 2,000.
Anonymous, thank you for your very insightful presentation. I have a question regarding family connection of terrorism, terrorist or extremist groups in Indonesia. How do you see the breakup relation between a father versus a son who are more loyal to AQ other than ISIS? I refer to a famous case where the son who joined Jamaat Ansarul Sharia or JAS versus the father in Jamaat Arshu Tawhid, JAT.
Well, he didn't join it, he founded it. He was one of the people who founded it. It's a very difficult situation. I can't imagine how gut-wrenching that was for both father and son, but especially for the son to break with his father in that way and to do it so publicly, and yet to feel like he had no choice. What I hope is, you know, as Abu Bakr Bashir has such few years on earth and has seen the error of his ways, that father and son are again rehabilitating their relationship. We do see this where the father you do see in Indonesian, Sidney Jones wrote this great small article on this, and Sulastri Osman wrote an academic article on this idea of the multi-generational jihadi family, and that is a chapter in becoming jihadis. This is something that is fascinating in Indonesia. I wouldn't say it's unique to Indonesia, but it happens a lot in Indonesia because terrorist groups in most of the world, when we look at terrorist groups, the majority have about a 1-year time horizon before they implode. In Indonesia, it's closer to 10 years. And you have some groups that have been operational in various capacities for 25, 30, and 50 years. And so you can have grandfather, father, son, these iterated generations of jihadi families where grandfather was Darul Islam, dad was Jamaah Islamiyah, and the son migrated and joined ISIS. You saw this with the family of Abdul Rauf, where his uncle Kang Jaja was, his family was Ring Banten. His uncle Kang Jaja ran Ring Banten. He was slated to be, he was sent to Ngruki. He was going to be one of the heads of Ring Banten. He had a 7-month-old child, and then he decides he's going to go and join ISIS, and he dies in Syria. And so does this happen often? Not so much, but it does happen. And it's very hard on families. It's incredibly hard on families, but it happens. more often than not, they stay within the same networks. They may not stay within the same groups, but the families stay within the same networks. That is far, far more common.
We got two more, maybe more. These two are slightly related. I'm going to ask them separately, though. First is broader. Do you agree that the potential of terrorism is really about economic matters or poorness as the main reason for terrorism acts? If we have more welfare programs, are we going to be solving the terrorism problem? What do you think?
I would say that all evidence on this subject says no, that these are correlations, not causation. If we look at the 9/11 bombers, the 9/11 bombers were middle class. Mohammed Hafez, in his dissertation book, Why Muslims Rebel, he showed that in the first chapter, he showed why the link doesn't bear out. It sounds like something that should bear out, but it doesn't. In the Philippines, when we look at, even in the Philippines, where I said that there were financial incentives, Sidney Jones's work on the Philippines said that the financial incentives weren't an issue. Why? Because when we look at recruitment to the Maute group and its affiliates, Sidney Jones was looking in a city, in the city of Cotabato. 1/3 of my participants were in a very poor rural district called Piagapo. Once you control for where we were, it wasn't the driving factor. The driving factor was who you knew.
Okay.
And wanting to participate in a jihad and being schooled from the time you were born that this was your destiny.
Here's a little more. Oh, go ahead.
It's much more, when we see the correlation, we should not assume causation.
This is slightly more pinpointed. Whoops. Where did it go? If the key, Blair King, one of our DC members.
I know Blair King. Hi,
Yeah,
Blair.
distinguished. If the key to disengagement and reintegration is developing an alternative social support network of family and friends, how can that be done while extremists are still active in jihadist groups? Or, to be realistic, is that really only an option once extremists have been separated from the jihadist community, for example, by imprisonment?
I love that question, and that's a fantastic question. If we look at, when we look at extremist groups, we assume you're in or you're out. We assume you're part of it or you're not part of it. But in point of fact, in Indonesia, you have active members, you have, and this is within Jemaah Islamiyah and its affiliates, you have active members, you have inactive members, and then you have the people who very quietly leave. They don't make a big scene about it. They don't do press releases or interviews about it, but they very quietly leave. Now, somebody who is inactive no longer receives orders, no longer has responsibilities, doesn't get opportunities, and doesn't get duties. But some of their friends may still socialize with them, especially if they're also in this inactive category where they are members of the community, but they are not necessarily outside it. And then you have the people who get out of jail, and so that is one option. And Blair, you might say, but then they're not really out. Inactive people can push, they don't de-radicalize, but they do disengage, and they can start reintegrating that way, even if they're still holding radical views. Now, but also let's be mindful that radical views don't always lead to radical actions. Now, second with that, you have cases of people who get out of jail and go back to families that did not approve of what they were doing, families who are committed or who have friends who visited them and said, hey, we want to help you. And these were their pre-group friends at a time when they are willing to listen. And this is the thing with families. Your family can talk to you until you're blue in the face, but they need to be present for you when you're open to listening. And in those cases, you don't have to be in jail. You could be out of jail. You could not have gone to jail yet. It will have an impact because you have that community. And then you start thinking, who do I want to be after? That is why the Institute for International Peace Building, for example, does such good work, because they really help with that professional development. Who do I want to be after? Also, Ali Fauci's Mutual Aid Society in Lamongan does great work with the former group, these inactive people. It gives them somebody to talk to. It gives them supports. It gives them places to send their children. And over time, it does help them to revisit and revise previously held extremist views without pushing it too hard. And to get them thinking, who do I want to be and what do I want to be? And it pushes and pushes and pushes in increments.
We're coming toward the end. I'm going to squeeze in one or two and then close.
Okay.
There's a multi-part question by Vikram Nehru of Johns Hopkins. I'll just take one. Papers by, and then I'll forward you the rest. Papers by the Institute of Policy Analysis of Conflict, IPAC, seem to suggest that jihadi cells are now very few and far between, and the capacity has been reduced. Do you agree with that? What's your assessment?
I would say that in the moment, yes. But the most recent IPAC reports have said, hey, we still have to watch this. For example, POSO, the release of 100 former members of extremist groups, 26 of them who were MET. They need, hey, we need to watch this. And even IPAC is saying that their capacity has been reduced, but even IPAC would say it is not a matter of if another attack ever occurs. This is something we do need to watch for in a few years, because all of those people, that nearly 1,000 people that are currently in varying stages of the prison system, they will get out at some point, and not all of them are going to say, you know what, we made a mistake. And we need to look for the rebuilding of cells, because this is a movement that will keep regenerating.
All right, I'm going to forward you the couple of questions we didn't get to, and you can choose to answer directly or through me. And just two nice things to close on. One person says, no question, but this was very insightful. Thank you for sharing some of your research, your analysis, and thoughtful responses to the question. The other one, hi, Julie, great to see you again, and thanks for the fascinating presentation and the answers to my questions. And that comes from Lucindo as well. So thank you so much. About a field that we don't look at frequently, and we need to know more about. And so does the Indonesian government.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And thanks to the audience as well. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.